2.
Hello and good afternoon, good morning to distinguished guests and colleagues connecting from all over the world. Thank you for joining us for today's panel on humanitarian access and gender-based violence in conflict in commemoration of the 16 Days of Activism against gender-based violence. My name is Mara Chavarria and I will be your moderator today. I am the campaign manager for the 16 Days of Activism from the Gender Office of the World Food Programme headquarters in Rome. Thank you all for joining today. Today's session is being recorded and will be shared with you all afterwards. There is a box for questions and answers on the top right, and you can send us your questions there. You can ask questions anonymously or directly, and we will have room for questions and answers after the panelist speaks. So without further ado, thanks again so much for joining, and I will now pass the floor to the Director of the Gender Office, Brenda Behan, for opening remarks. Brenda, the floor is yours. Brenda, you're muted.
Okay, I hope I'm not muted now.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mar, and hello, colleagues and guests. We're very excited to see you joining us here today and joining the panel that is supporting the 16 Days of Activism campaign. This campaign is actually turning 30 years old, and for 30 years, we've been wearing orange to demonstrate our commitment to fighting gender-based violence. And unfortunately, year after year, we see that despite years of fighting against gender-based violence, we have gender-based violence committed across the globe. And there continue to be aggravating factors that increase the risk and incidence of GBV globally. In this year, we've particularly highlighted how COVID, conflict, and climate change have not only increased food security, but also have increased gender-based violence. And we continue to see that the same factors that aggravate risks of food insecurity also aggravate risks of gender-based violence. And this is one of the reasons we promote gender equality in our mandate of Zero Hunger, because we recognize that there's an undeniable link between the two. We continue to celebrate this campaign and use it as an opportunity to denounce the increasing threats of GBV, but not only for that announcement, but also to take action across all sectors and countries, and to raise awareness as a means of one day ending this violence. Today's panel will focus on gender-based violence in the context of situations of conflict and on the settings of humanitarian response where access is critical. WFP, of course, works in many conflict settings, and we have to be very aware of the risks of GBV involved in those settings. One of the particular risks is a barrier to access, and that's another theme of today's panel. We will be hearing from very exciting experts in the panel. We have our WFP colleague calling in from Kabul, as well as partners of OCHA, UN Women, and UNFPA from the 4 areas which are facing some level of conflict today in Afghanistan, in Tigray, in Gaza, and in Nigeria. So we'll hear from all of them about the ongoing situation in each of those areas, what work is being done on the ground, and the challenges and the risks they have identified so far. We also have the pleasure of having a guest keynote speaker from OCHA, who is one of our dear partners, and her name is April Pham. She is the Senior Gender Advisor and the head of the Gender Unit at OCHA New York. So April, very warm welcome to you, and we're excited to hear from you and then follow on with the panel. Thank you, and April, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Brenda and WFP colleagues, for the invitation to join this conversation. I have to say I'm super excited because I really want to hear from colleagues, and in particular those in the countries that are experiencing some of the most critical humanitarian crises, and also where there are access constraints that really speak to some of the issues that we want to address today. So very excited to listen to you. I just have a couple of points just to, to provoke some of our thinking as we progress in the panel. But firstly, I also want to just say, to echo what Brenda has just said around the 30 years of 16 days of activism against violence against women. Now, I started this campaign, I was involved in this campaign since its earlier days when it was a grassroots campaign. And I want for us to think about this because this wasn't a UN initiated campaign. This came from communities, from women leaders who mobilized for there to be much more awareness around these issues. And it's reached to this point where the UN has taken it on, we've owned it, and that the UN agencies like OCHA and WFP are convening and having these conversations really means that we are at the peak of awareness. So again, back to what Brenda was saying, how do we now translate the awareness into action? Because we can't just have 30 years of awareness. There's been lots of developments, but there's also been little progress in terms of protection for women and girls, and in particular in conflict settings. So if I can just start with, giving us a global overview of, the status at play. Last week, we launched the Global Humanitarian Overview, and we called for $41 billion to respond to the ever-growing humanitarian needs. And of course, part of this is also to respond to gender equality and gender-based violence. 274 million people will need humanitarian assistance and protection. And this number is significantly increased from only 235 million a year ago. So this is like one of the highest numbers we have ever. Over 24.4 million people in Afghanistan will need assistance, 25.9 million in Ethiopia, 8.3 million in Nigeria. And of course, I want to also mention that Yemen is also one of our, crises that is often forgotten, where there's still 20.7 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, and Syria with another 14 million. So the needs are quite high. Hunger is rising and food insecurity is just at an unprecedented level. So the role of WFP in the response is going to be critical. Globally, we have 811 million people who are malnourished, and famine-like conditions remain real and terrifying for at least 43 countries across the world. And unless we act immediately, there will be catastrophes all around. And we know that the impact on this will be predominantly felt by women and girls. On top of these crises, we also have increased attacks on humanitarian workers and assets. And this is an important consideration when we talk about humanitarian access and how it impedes or enables our access to communities. 117 humanitarian workers were killed in 2020. 108 of these were working in their own countries. So again, I really want to hone it back to it's a local actors, it's our communities who are affected by crisis, who are at further risk of violence themselves when they try to enable humanitarian assistance. As Brenda already noted, COVID is still with us and causing havoc in so many different ways, and in particular in countries that are already impacted by conflict. Women have been the hardest hit economically, and especially because they represent the majority of the informal sector. And this is really important because a lot of that informal sector work is in the agriculture and food production as well. It's already been clearly established that gender-based violence has been one of the key impacts of COVID, with lockdowns and so forth. And sorry. Many countries have seen increased calls to hotlines, increased calls and demands for support and protection for survivors, and are still struggling to respond to the ever-growing needs. Every day we hear accounts of how climate change, conflict, and humanitarian situations are triggering more violence. Sexual violence perpetrated against women and girls in the Sahel as they seek food and fuel, having to walk longer distances because of drought. Girls are dropping out of school or not returning after the lockdown. And we have increased early marriage and teenage pregnancies as a result. We have families who are forced into situations of having to marry off their girls earlier, much earlier, and also selling their children, as we've heard in the case of Afghanistan. Extremely harrowing situations that no family, and in particular no mother or father, should be put in. In addition, we have the Secretary General's annual report that notes 205,000 verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence committed in 2020 across 18 countries. So I just wanted to start the conversation by highlighting that it's 1 in 3 women that experience some form of violence in their lifetime, in peacetime, but in humanitarian emergencies, those risks are heightened. And in particular, in places like Afghanistan, you have up to 9 in 10 women will have experienced some form of intimate partner violence. So we're talking about very high numbers in some of the locations that we work in. What I really want to highlight, though, is the connection to food security and food insecurity and how this manifests or translates into heightened risk of gender-based violence, and how we have to find avenues to mitigate the fallout. In Ethiopia, the latest analysis shows a very concerning pattern of survival sex, of young girls and women increasingly engaging in in the sex work industry and trading sex for food and for services because of desperation. Access to assistance, humanitarian and development, and I really want to underscore this, it's not only up to us as humanitarians to intervene and to support, it has to be this integrated approach between humanitarian and development action to address some of these access constraints. Humanitarian access in Tigray remains greatly impeded, and I'm sure we'll hear this from from colleagues, and this is becoming very challenging for us to have access to survivors of sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence. I look forward to hearing a little bit more on that. In Afghanistan, while the humanitarian situation is grave and deteriorating, there is at least some glimmer of hope in that there is an increased and varied access. So from what we've seen, access in terms of humanitarian access is dependent on who the leadership at the local levels in the provinces, in the districts are. And so obviously WFP, OCHA, and the various other organizations working on the ground are continuing to negotiate for more access. And I think that's at least heartening. What is not heartening, though, is meanwhile, we have shelters that usually provide support to survivors of domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence almost closed down. We only have 2, it's 2 out of 24 women protection centers that are supported by UN Women that are currently operational. So that's nothing. And only 5 of the 25 family guidance centers are currently functioning. So access to these shelters are critical and will be critical as we move forward. So in conclusion, I really want for us to think about, as we have this panel discussion, the following issues. The response must be an integrated approach with other sectors. It can't just be a protection response. It needs to include food, it needs to include health, it needs to include all of these other critical sectors. How can we bring a gender lens and a protection lens in all of the work that we do when it comes to food programming? Engagement with local actors will be critical, and I think the lack of access that we are experiencing right now in many of these challenging situations, again, highlight that these are our interlocutors and our most valued resources that must be further explored and championed? How do we find local organizations and networks and resource them to do some of this work? As well as, we also need to be responsible to assess the risks that they face and to help them mitigate some of those risks. This is critical, especially when it comes to local women working in such organizations and in such volatile environments, as they are often targeted for harassment and physical attacks. How do we look at ways to support the recruitment and retention of female staff, as this is critical to ensure access to women? This ensures that women, this means that we need to ensure that we have women on our teams always in engaging with local communities and local interlocutors. How do we look at ways to increase women and girls' access to services? So, for example, in Yemen, they really expanded through looking at expanding hotlines, and some of those digital processes in order to have access to women, especially when mobility was an issue. And lastly, increasing international presence. How do we scale up as well? At the same time that we're engaging with local actors, we also need to examine, our own capacity and how we increase that, because this presence is critical as a form of protection to local staff. Access is critical, and local women can be the great vehicle for access, but they must be supported and protected. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion on some of the practices and some of the challenges that you all face. And thank you so much again for the invitation to speak.
Thank you so much, April. And thank you, Ocha, for your partnership and for participating. It's great to see that there's other UN agency partners that are non-gender specialized agencies, but that still have such a strong gender unit. And it's also great to hear that you are a pioneer in the campaign of 16 Days of Activism. So now we will go ahead and begin our panel, our very exciting panel, very relevant, inviting 4 areas of conflict that we work in: Afghanistan, Tigray, Gaza, and Nigeria. And of course, we're going to begin our panel with our most discussed country in this year's campaign, which of course is Afghanistan. Now, we are all aware of the recent events in Afghanistan and how they have affected gender equality in GBV. We're very honored today to be starting our panel in-house. Our next panelist is the Deputy Country Director of WFP Afghanistan Country Office, Xiaowei Li. So thank you so much, Xiaowei, for joining us from Kabul. Now, my question to you is, what are the current challenges to humanitarian access into Afghanistan? And of course, what impacts or implications have you observed that they've had on GBV? So thank you so much, Xiaowei, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Your question asks about our current humanitarian access challenges, and I wanted to maybe also speak about how in many ways our humanitarian access challenges are not completely different from before August 2021, when the Taliban had taken over. Before, much of the country and much of Afghanistan was actually Taliban controlled. And we worked in Taliban controlled areas over the 20 years, over the past 20 years. We'd also had established contacts with Taliban authorities to address both access issues and negotiate access based on humanitarian principles. And it is from that we were able to then draw with an understanding and certain established understanding of way of working to work in the way that we work now. There are some differences with Taliban now controlling at the central level. For one, they are setting policies that is more at the central level. And many of those policies are still pending, either to be decided or to be announced. And while it remains pending, it has at times hindered access. For example, for many weeks and actually even months, the ability for women staff to work in the humanitarian sector was unknown. And that was certainly something that had been discussed much at length within the humanitarian community around how to address that. Even though some of those policy decisions were pending at the central level, we were then able to gain access at more local levels. The other one that is still pending is for girls' ability to go to secondary school. And those are, again, where some locations have taken a divergence of views temporarily until a central level decision is made. And while we have been managing our access to provide assistance, I think it's also important to recognize access challenges on communities and beneficiaries to access our assistance. What we have seen is increased restrictions on the movement of women, which effectively impedes their access to services. For example, access to nutrition clinics in our case. And we've also seen it as well as access to education. The full impact of the Taliban's ideology on gender is not yet completely known, and we will then be able to see the impact. I would also say that it's important to recognize that there actually have been some improvements in our access. And this comes largely because of reduced conflict and insecurity incidences, at least for now. Taliban concerns around conflict in the past had led to access blockages, and we had to find workarounds, which sometimes delayed our ability to provide assistance, and that has lessened. When it comes to gender-based violence and in general around gender parity, I wanted to note that there has been good progress over the past 20 years, but it's also been limited. And if we were to look at some of the key data on gender-based violence in Afghanistan, we would see that before August 2021, 46% of Afghan women experienced intimate partner violence in their previous 12 months. 91% of women faced GBV in tertiary education institutions, including from teachers. And 87% of women experienced sexual harassment at work. And so it is now incredibly important for us to also look at how the GBV drivers have changed over August, because unfortunately the situation has deteriorated and key pre-existing drivers have actually increased, namely that of the economic insecurity and increased displacement. We have also seen that many female-headed civil society organizations and safe houses have been shut down. And then there's what can we do about it? Humanitarian access is especially important for GBV, mitigation in fragility and conflict settings, because normally in such settings, they lack the infrastructure to identify and address GBV. For example, functioning legal systems, specialized services, healthcare, etc. Meanwhile, the drivers are extremely high. And as WFP, we look at how we're able to address that. Our assistance so first I would say our assistance, we look at a do no harm approach. We make sure that our assistance does not contribute to GBV, but there is also more that we can do in terms of addressing the drivers of GBV as well as mitigating the negative consequences of GBV. We can leverage our assistance first by increasing or actually reducing household stressors. So I mentioned earlier about the economic stressors and economic shock. So where we're able to provide some of the economic transfers via cash-based transfers, food assistance, we're then able to reduce those economic stressors. We can also help to mitigate GBV exposure during help seeking by creating safe spaces for women to collect food and other commodities. And that's quite critical for women who right now desperately need such assistance. And then I would also say that unfortunately, because of the increased vulnerabilities that we're seeing, the desperation that we're seeing, you may have seen in the news of families selling children and families selling their babies in order to feed their families. And that does create or increase harmful marriage practices, such as trading girls or child marriages and ultimately selling their children. And so our assistance can hopefully mitigate that. We can also leverage our assistance actually through local advocacy. Ultimately, we can try to reduce some of the harmful attitudes that are towards women and girls through community-based interventions. When we have our food distributions, it's an opportunity for us to provide that communication because we're ultimately gathering people in a large setting, and we can use that for local advocacy. We also, because we provide a very valued commodity, we have certain leverage to be able to message things that may be difficult for other actors to do. And so that's an opportunity for us to help ultimately lead to more open mindsets. And we can also look at how we can increase women's participation. We want to make sure that women are involved in the design of humanitarian assistance and the delivery of humanitarian assistance, and that they remain as part of the workplace. And I want to say it's not gender parity for gender parity's sake. We know that women's participation leads to better assistance because the population we serve includes women and girls. And that actually has featured very prominently in some of the negotiations that we've had with the Taliban and de facto authorities. When we say that we can't do an assessment without women to go see a kitchen and see what a household looks like, that actually is accepted, as opposed to talking about, for example, women's right to work. And so we want to make sure that women remain engaged. And there are, for example, teachers who are currently unpaid and out of work, and our ability to engage them as part of our workforce, at least temporarily, could at least keep them in the public space. And lastly, I would just mention that we really would also be looking at stronger partnerships with protection mandated agencies. I mentioned earlier that we have the ability to leverage our assistance, and we can therefore work with partners to create spaces for protection actors to travel with us and be present during WFP activities in more restricted locations. And this is often possible if we really plan it well and are able to do so. I think the last bit I would add is just what April had mentioned around the presence of international organizations. The fact that UN agencies and WFP, for example, had stayed throughout the crisis, I think has meant a lot. Our country director was here throughout the crisis, and she's noticed a difference in the tone when she mentions to her interlocutors as she's negotiating that she was here throughout the crisis. And therefore, then she's more receptive, better received. And so that allows us to have the stance to be able to negotiate humanitarian access, including for women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Xiaowei, for your intervention. Thank you so much for sharing this. I know WFP is extremely proud to have both women as country and deputy directors in Afghanistan right now, both working in Kabul. So thank you so much for connecting from Kabul. Thank you for sharing this very critical and relevant information on the current situation in Afghanistan. And of course, thank you for the work that you're continuing to do for women and girls of Afghanistan. This panel obviously would not be the same without this intervention. So thank you so much. Our next panelist is perhaps the second most discussed country in this year's campaign, which is Tigray and Ethiopia. Now, we know that this is probably one of the more recent conflicts that has arose in this past year, and that, of course, there's a strong implications on access and gender-based violence. So very happy to introduce our next panelist, which is Chacha Maisuri, who is the GBV coordinator in the Tigray region for UNFPA Ethiopia. So Chacha, my question for you is, can you explain a little bit, especially for those colleagues that aren't aware what's going on in Tigray, what is the current situation in Tigray, northern Ethiopia? What access barriers are there, and what impacts have you observed on gender-based violence? So thank you for joining us, Chacha. The floor is yours, and unmute yourself.
Mar, colleagues, thank you very much, and good morning and good afternoon for the colleagues from the different parts of the world. As Ma has said, my name is Chacha Maisori. I'm currently coordinating the GBV area of responsibility in Tigray, Northern Ethiopia response. And essentially, to dive straight into the question, basically quick overview of events. As we may all know, approximately 600,000 people were already dependent on food aid long before the crisis started on the 4th of November 2020. The conflict broke out between the federal forces and the Tigray regional forces. Basically, that part of forces that is loyal to the Tigrayan People Liberation Front. And of course, immediately the first ban on travel and communication was put into effect by the federal government. Of course, this conflict continued to ensue with the TPLF forces having fled from the major cities and towns until around June 28, when basically the federal government declared a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew the forces. And of course, in an immediate rejoinder, the TPLF spilled over their conflict, attacking the neighboring Amara and Afar. And basically, this has continued to date with their intention to try and take up the capital of the country. Essentially, immediately after the November 4th conflict, on the 28th of November, the federal government and the UN started negotiations, and until on the 2nd of December, it was then signed an agreement to have humanitarians being allowed to move into Tigray and to set up the much needed life-saving humanitarian interventions in the region. Essentially, this has continued, but as I already said, 2.1 million are internally displaced people as a consequence of this conflict. 45,000 are approximately living as refugees in Sudan, in the Kassala region. We are looking at about 4.2 million people in urgent humanitarian aid. Colleagues, remember 52% of the population is women and girls. So essentially, we are looking at slightly more than half of the population being the women and girls whom this conflict is affecting in quite a number of ways, and significantly for that matter. After the conflict spilled over into Amara, it has further displaced another 1.2 million in Amara and another 700,000 in Afar. And of course, overall, we are looking at about 8.1 million people who are targeted for various forms of humanitarian aid in the three regions, Amara, Afar, and the Tigray itself. In all, about 9.4 million people in the northern Ethiopia alone are people who are in need of food assistance. So again, going back to the point that 52% of these 9.4 million people, we are talking about women and children. And remember, the men and boys are already been forcefully recruited into conflict. Majority of them are already into the conflict one way or another on either side of the belligerents. So essentially, we are looking at the women and girls immediately taking and assuming the responsibility to head the households, to fend for the families, take care of the children, be the ones to ensure that there is security for their children, be there to ensure that the property and whatever they have left is still being protected, because this has suddenly become their responsibility. But without much of further ado, we are looking at access, what has changed basically. Before the 28th of June 2021, access within Tigray was actually very, very poor, given the fact that there was a lot of involvement of the federal and the Eritrean forces being active in various zones of the Tigray region. And of course, in an interesting rejoinder, when the withdrawal happened on the 28th of June, suddenly Tigray became very, very much accessible, except the western part where they continued the conflict to block off the possibility that the Tigrayan forces can access the Sudan through the western part, whereby the Amhara forces, special forces, the Fano, the Eritrean forces, as well as the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, all combined took cover of that area, and it has remained in their hand ever since. Now, regardless of access improving to almost 85% within Tigray after the 28th of June, suddenly the ban that had been there was reinstated. And suddenly now we have access to all the Wareda, we have access to all these regions, we have access to all the villages, but we can't get in anything because communication is gone, electricity is gone, banking services have been closed, looking at a restriction of cash movement, restriction of fuel, restriction of humanitarian supplies, both medical, non-food items, dignity kits, looking at the inability to move cash and therefore salaries for staff, cash for programming, the cash and voucher assistance system all collapsed, because then there was this embargo or blockade that was put in place immediately as a rejoinder to the withdrawal and counter-attack that happened in Afar and Amara after the 28th of June. So essentially, this has been a major challenge that we have had to stay with, and looking at now very, very quickly dropping supplies of food in the warehouses, looking at a significant almost near zero fall of non-food items, a major fall in medical supplies. Hospitals have run dangerously low of all the critical drugs. When we talk about drugs for the chronic and non-communicable diseases, these are completely lacking in the hospitals. Women and girls are unable to get dignity kits because this is an item that is classified, again, for whatever reason, as a medical item, and therefore getting it into the region is a major, major, major difficulty. And therefore, again, the menstrual hygiene situation for our women and girls is in a very extreme and dire situation that is really not interesting to talk about. We are looking at a seriousness of our need for a minimum of around 100 trucks of food and supplies per day, but you can imagine between the 24th and the 24th of October and the 30th of November, 4 convoys of about 157 trucks with humanitarian supplies arrived in Mekelle. Those were the only ones in a space of a month, away from the 100 trucks on a minimum per day. So looking at supplies of 157 trucks for a period of over a month and a few days. So essentially the situation is quite complicated when it comes, humanitarians. And, immediately after the month of November started, we went into a spate of aerial bombings. And these aerial bombings has actually resulted in a need to have the international staffs mainly being relocated from the Tigray region in order to, for safety reasons, on the basis of the Secretary General advice and order. And therefore, we now have a very, very limited number of staff and NGOs remaining behind, mostly national, mostly staff who cannot be relocated because they are Tigrinya in tribe, and therefore they are unable to move out of the region. And this has resulted in a really, really over 82% of the humanitarian workforce is no longer in Tigray, and therefore you can imagine what that means when it comes to a response. Now, as I move towards the end, colleagues, this situation has significantly undermined the resilience of women and girls, exacerbating protection concerns, looking at heightened risks. We are talking about risks including physical safety, psychosocial well-being, looking at up to about 1.5 million girls and women, including about 810,000 boys and 700 men and women being actually on the direct line of difficulty because they cannot access the life-saving different types of humanitarian needs that they have, including GBV. There are increasing reports, very worrying reports of negative coping mechanisms, which April did mention earlier, and thank you very much for your opening remarks. This is actually a major concern. Even in the recent human rights report, it was quite vivid that coping mechanisms are really taking or tending towards a very negative side. We have growing survival sex, increasingly happening. And remember, colleagues, a very interesting turn, and allow me to say this very quickly. We are looking at things like internet that a few years ago was not a significant thing, but you will find thousands, if not hundreds of young people, girls and boys in the front of the gate of the IOM, where there is the only VSAT internet, attempting to get internet in whichever way they can, including trying to be nice to the humanitarians who have access into the compound. And this alone in itself is also tending towards an interesting and another form of risk for sexual exploitation and abuse just to access internet. So essentially, colleagues, this blockade has not been an easy one for the women and girls in Tigray. Of course, for the men and boys, when it comes to families being now forcefully asked to contribute their able-bodied men and boys to be able to join the different sides of the war. Essentially, the Tigray is also massively recruiting. The ENDF, the national government, is also significantly recruiting. So essentially, we are looking at a pattern that is quite worrying. And in as much as it is really affecting the women and girls, the men and boys have not been spared in their own way as it comes to the being conscripted into war. So, Mar and colleagues, allow me to stop here and take any questions if there are. Many thanks, and over to you, Mar.
Thank you so much, Chacha. Thank you so much for sharing to our colleagues what is currently happening in Tigray and what limitations there have been, not only in terms of geographical access barriers, as we clearly saw on the map that changed drastically in a matter of months, but also in terms of lack of access to very important resources that are needed by not just people, but particularly women and girls. So thank you so much. We are now continuing our panel. We will have time for questions and answers at the end, but we're going to another important region in the world that is heavily affected by conflict and GBV, the Middle East. Our next panelist is joining us from Gaza. Now, when it comes to discussing conflict and access, Gaza is perhaps one of the most unique examples, one of the largest ongoing conflicts, over 70 years of conflict and over a decade of a blockade, not just through land, but also sea and air. So we're very happy to be welcoming our next panelist, who is Heba Zayed, the head of the Gaza sub-office in UN Women Palestine. So Heba, thank you for joining us. My question to you is, can you explain to our colleagues today what the particular challenges with access that exist in Gaza are? And of course, combined with the conflict, how have both of these impact gender-based violence? So Heba, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mar. Thanks to you and thanks to WFP for giving us this opportunity and for the very interesting insights that we've heard from other guest speakers during the panel. For Gaza, of course, as you've already mentioned, it's part and parcel of the question of Palestine, and Palestine being under occupation for more than 50 years, and Gaza being under a blockade basically for more than 14 years now. And the issue of access in Gaza really takes different meanings and different interpretations. Of course, now we have the map here, there is the issue of the physical access, or what we also refer to as freedom of movement of people in Gaza. So you have the Gaza Strip, which is an enclave of land, very small area, very densely populated. You have a population of over 2 million people that live there, one of the most densely populated areas in the planet. And then literally you have 2 exits for people in this area. One of them is through a border crossing with Egypt, which is called Rafah, and then the other is with Israel, which is called Erez crossing. And these 2 crossings basically is the only crossings through which people can leave the Gaza Strip into the outside world. As you know, Gaza does not have an airport, it does not have a port, so people cannot travel out or into Gaza without having to cross through Egypt or through Israel and through, I have to say, since the blockade, very complicated travel procedures. So it's very, very common in Gaza that you have a young person between the age of 18 to 30 that has never been outside the Gaza Strip, and all that they know of this world they have known through the internet and through basically other means, mainly media means. So not only Gaza is under blockade, of course, Gaza has been characterized, and as OCHA basically mentions in almost every humanitarian needs overview, it's a protracted humanitarian crisis, it's a protracted protection crisis, where also the rights of people to their human rights, their protection from all types of violence are very, very challenged. And of course, as we all know, that all of these issues, mainly conflict, as it intersects with dynamics of the blockade, also the impact of occupation, etc., have gendered impacts that affect women's and girls' protection, and they also affect children. And that's why when I said that we have to look at access from different perspectives, first you have the issue of the geographical access that I just mentioned that has all types of manifestations. And let me walk you through some of the examples. For instance, you have a major escalation in Gaza, and we've had 4 in about 10 years now, since 2009. Between 2008-9 to 2021, we had 4 major escalations, conflicts that led to major destruction of housing and to major displacements inside, internal displacements inside the Gaza Strip. So after an escalation happens, the issue of access would really prevent getting housing material inside the Gaza Strip to build houses, which means that women who used to have their own houses have to now move and live either in shelters or sometimes in overcrowded households, which are usually, households of relatives, etc., etc. So usually a family with what we would call positive family dynamics and power relations would change the setting completely and be challenged with having to live in an overcrowded household with other relatives with extremely limited economic means. So if we would assume that this family was not suffering from gender-based violence before the crisis happened, then all the indications would automatically lead to either an increase of gender-based violence or to the incidence overall. So we've had basically women telling us that we've never experienced violence until we lost the house. We've never even had that type of relationship with our spouse, with the male spouse, until we lost the house. So an issue that is at core an issue of access of material becomes a question on the protection of women and girls. And of course, when you want to basically join that with things that relate to socioeconomic, of course, an area, as my colleague also has mentioned before me, an area that's facing blockade is facing, of course, economic pressures, meaning less jobs, meaning less decent income, meaning economic sectors that are completely suffocated or are suffocating because of the blockade, which, of course, we know that economic sectors, before having these let me say drivers in place, already are not very much hospitable to women and girls. So you have very small percentage in the formal labor market in Palestine, for instance. It is less than 20%, one of the lowest in the world. And then you have women in the informal sector also facing injustices and discrimination because the informal sector is not regulated, they're not protected by law, etc. So when we take the same example and look at families not being able to generate enough income and having people being pushed to become poor, basically by, again, the conflict, that would automatically, as we know, increase percentages of gender-based violence. So again, issue of access that is preventing economic sectors from flourishing becomes very much a threat to women's and girls' protection. So basically in Palestine, just to run very, very quick examples, and I think we do not fall away from overall trends. we have around 29% overall of women that have experienced violence at the hands of their husbands, at least one. And this percentage is basically 37 in Gaza. And less than 20 something in the West Bank. And of course, that relates to exactly what I have mentioned of issues that relate to access. So one level of looking at it, that access issues basically have this over-encompassing impact on people's life and create drivers of marginalization, of poverty, of exclusion, of vulnerability. And then we have those vulnerabilities unfortunately intersect, and then they become gender specific, like gender specific vulnerabilities, gender-based risks and vulnerabilities that start to connect issues such as, again, for instance, from substandard housing, that you don't have a house that supports you, to issues of disability, if you have one family member that faces disability, and what this means for women caregivers, caretakers, of added, reproductive role pressures, etc. And then again, having the family dynamics and the gender norms being extremely changing, and then becoming also let me say quite negative, and at the same time having issues with access to income security, lack services, etc. So that is one part of it. The second part of it becomes access to services, which I think my colleagues have mentioned through different presentations in Gaza, that also uniquely first increases, of course, gender-based violence percentages, and makes the response also very, very challenged. I mean, first makes the prevention problematic and makes the response problematic, because people, women in those families that are, as I mentioned, unfortunately now the majority by all percentages around unemployment, around poverty, etc. They face major difficulties in accessing reproductive health, sexual health services. They face difficulties in getting sometimes educational opportunities, which, by the way, relate also to the blockade dynamics, and which I did not mention, because again, when you have a blockade in place, it's much less likely for a university graduate to be able to leave the Strip for a university opportunity. It's much less likely to get a scholarship outside of the Gaza Strip, because again, you're challenged, you cannot travel. And then also it's much more likely that you would have an increase over extremist views, because you're not mixing with the outside world. And all of that, if you put it again in the same pot, would mean that it would challenge basically women's protection and their status in their communities. So I think again, back to the issue of access to services that I've just mentioned, is that the issue of access to services very much relates to empowerment paradigms. And we've been thinking about it mostly from the lens of that if you have marginalized women, we would make the assumption that they are the ones who should access the services, and since they need the service. But then we always neglect the fact that their capability to access the service relates to their access and control over resources inside their households, how much they can actually navigate solutions inside the family that can, in terms of getting out, for instance, and go to a shelter for women's victims of violence, or to go for a multi-purpose center. And we assume because they have the problem, they have to do it. And we've done the awareness and we've provided the helpline. But then when we try to understand and unpack more and more, we find the issues in Gaza also relate to the same issues that I've mentioned, meaning resources, poverty, family dynamics, etc. And that's why more and more around assistance programming to GBV survivors, we have, in my opinion, and we've been piloting here in Gaza more and more, to find ways of providing the service that connect definitely to income security and livelihood and cash for work programming and unconditional cash assistance and internship and job placements, etc., where a protection intervention is not only focused on providing the psychosocial assistance or the legal assistance or the case management or the referral. It connects to other interventions where you can actually get women outside the abusive environment and get them to become more like transform from the sort of victims to the agents of finding this solution, of finding a solution outside of the problem. So I think I don't know how much time I have, but I think to summarize, I think the Gaza Strip continues, unfortunately, in a difficult situation, and a solution, a political solution, does not also look as something that is there out of the crisis situation that we have. And all the drivers that we have, including the May escalation in 2021, continue to make the issue of gender-based violence, and including, of course, COVID-19, and having this shadow pandemic as well because of COVID-19, makes it quite difficult. So a solution to some of the political problems would definitely pave way for some solutions over this problem inside Gaza. So it cannot only be aid focused or humanitarian aid related. It definitely helps, it definitely alleviates, it definitely support people quit negative coping mechanisms, that's for sure, or find proper streams of assistance, that's for sure. But eventually we're not working in vacuum in Palestine and nowhere in the world. Basically, trends are against you, dynamics are against you, drivers are against you. So we get a solution for 1,000 women, and then you have conflict, and then everything becomes much worse for all of them. So I think in terms of seeing this from access and freedom of movement perspective, a political solution and lifting the blockade might make a huge change. If we want to look at it from the perspective of service provision and what we can do, I think there is enough from colleagues to learn from into how to do this. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heba, for sharing this critical example from Gaza. It is an area, of course, as you just mentioned, that has been in this very difficult situation for a long time, for too long. And this is why it's important we continue to give advocacy opportunities to Gaza and Palestine so that hopefully one day this blockade will end. Thank you so much, Heba, for joining us today. Now, we're going to another part of the world now, back to Africa. A country in Africa that, of course, has previously been on the spotlight for its dramatic cases of gender-based violence and conflict. And we're talking about Nigeria. So with us today, we're very excited to be hosting Salematu Kemokai, who is the Senior Gender Capacity Specialist for UN Women Nigeria. Now, like I said, Nigeria has previously been on the spotlight for gender-based violence and conflict, particularly due to the kidnapping and forced marriage of schoolgirls, notably recognized during the Bring Back Our Girls campaign movement, which some of you probably are familiar with. So Salematu, can you elaborate on these cases, these intense cases of GBV and conflict that influenced the campaign, and also what barriers to access have you seen in Nigeria, which perhaps are not as well known as the other areas of intervention? So Salematu, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ma. Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I wish to kindly thank you, Ma, and all of you for having me here. And I would like to kindly ask your permission to stand on existing protocols that have been already established. Just to mention again that Nigeria is in West Africa, and the crisis in Northeast Nigeria has been going on for about 12 years now. I really want to appreciate WFP for organizing this very important panel discussion that has helped me to have further insight into what are the access barriers to GBV in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Palestine. And I must say that as my colleagues speak, I felt at some point as though they were also in Nigeria. You know, the situations are quite similar, although we have peculiarities. For instance, as in the case of Afghanistan, where children are being sold, and that is not yet the case in Nigeria, and we pray it will never be the case. So I would also want to just add that in addition to the introduction that has been done by Mar, also a Norwegian capacity, often called NORCAP for short, that is deployed to UN Women here in Nigeria. So for a bit of convenience, I would like to divide my presentation into two parts. And firstly, I'll speak to the issue of the kidnapping and forced marriage of schoolgirls, and then the access barriers. As a lot of us, or many of us would know, kidnapping and forced marriage of schoolgirls is somehow a weapon of war in Northeast Nigeria and the conflict, and which has also spilled over to other conflict-affected areas like the Northwest. Thousands of girls and young women have been abducted by non-state armed groups in Northeast Nigeria, including from their schools. These non-state armed groups, otherwise popularly known as Boko Haram, also abduct boys and men and force them into becoming fighters. Many have never returned from captivity, and those who have returned report suffering abuse, including sexual and gender-based violence. A key component of Boko Haram's ideology is hostility towards secular or Western education, and this makes school children their target. Kidnappings occur every now and then, but the massive abduction of 276 girls from their boarding school dormitory in the northeastern town of Chibok in 2014 particularly brought the issue to global attention. To date, over 100 are still missing, and there are reports that about 40 of them have died. In 2018, again, another set of 110 girls were abducted from a government secondary school in Dapchi, Yobe State. Yobe State is also in Northeast Nigeria, and it's one of the states that is at the center of the conflict. But 101 were shortly released, and unfortunately 5 died during the process of abduction. Another more recent one was in February this year, 2021, where about 200 schoolgirls were kidnapped by unidentified gunmen from a boarding school in Zamfara State, which is also in northwestern Nigeria. Kidnappings of especially schoolgirls are quite rampant, but schoolboys are also not exempted. In this same year, February again, there were reports that 26 boys and 16 staff members were abducted from the government science college in Niger State. And there are also many smaller abductions that go unreported, and they do not make headlines or they are not in the media because of the scale or the magnitude. So it is important to note that the impact of attacks on women and girls is often different from that on boys and men. Some of the released women and girls report that Boko Haram had forced them to convert to Islam and subjected them to forced marriage and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence. Others report being held in prison-like conditions where they are repeatedly raped. Some ultimately become pregnant because of rape. Some victims, especially those who refuse to convert to Islam or marry a fighter, also report being forced to work long hours for the wives and families of insurgents, and are being threatened and beaten when they were too exhausted to continue to work. Some girls and women are also forced to participate in or aid Boko Haram attacks. Notably, Boko Haram uses abducted girls as suicide bombers because they are least suspected, as opposed to boys and young men. From the GBV ripple effect, setting in motion a range of negative impacts such as loss of education, early marriage, early pregnancy, and stigma associated with sexual violence and children born from rape. All of these can dramatically affect the female's status in future as well. So these harms often exacerbate and are exacerbated by pre-existing forms of gender discrimination and harmful practices that negatively affect girls and women. The abductions create a ripple effect, setting in motion a range of negative impacts, such as loss of education that I've also mentioned. And we have also seen that survivors have reported suffering mental and physical health problems because of the abuses they have suffered. Some described continuing to endure bleeding and other serious gynecological problems because of rape. So in terms of giving a brief cultural context of GBV in North East Nigeria, which provides a basis for some of the access barriers, we have seen that the vulnerability of women and girls to gender-based violence, especially sexual violence, is in the Northeast. In the Northeast, is deeply rooted in the culture, where their levels of access to power and resources, as compared to men and boys, is very minimal. Practices such as polygamy, early or child, at times forced marriage, traditional harmful practices such as widowhood practices, among others, are quite common in the Northeast. And consequently, gender-based violence has emerged as one of the major manifestations of the conflict, resulting into increased vulnerabilities for women and girls to abduction, rape, violence, and also exploitation. In a data snapshot on women and children compiled by UNICEF quite recently in 2021, this is also to just give you an overview of what the cultural situation is that also makes some of these cases go unreported. So we have about 28% of females and 20% of males aged between 15 and 49 years who think that a husband is justified to hit or beat his wife under certain circumstances, such as refusing to have sexual intercourse with him, neglecting children, going out without telling them, arguing with him, or burning food. So these are some of the reasons for which a lot of the cases also go unreported and making data collection quite inadequate. So with regards to access barriers, it is also appalling to report that gender-based barriers and vulnerabilities such as early marriage are perceived as a form of protection for girls and for economic reasons within the context of the conflict-affected region of Northeast Nigeria. Adolescent girls are married off early, and some deliberately get pregnant, irrespective of whether they are married or not, to avoid being kidnapped by non-state armed groups who have high preference for virgins. The situation has been further exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, wherein we also saw a situation wherein in the rapid gender analysis that was done by UN Women Care and Oxfam, it was reported that one of the findings was that parents were now marrying off their girls to reduce the number of people in homes and also for economic reasons. You know, the issue of social distancing is also coming into play here. At the peak of the COVID pandemic in Nigeria in 2020, incidents of GBV also increased exponentially due to confinement of vulnerable women and girls in homes with their abusers, exacerbating the already high levels of violence endured by women and girls, and prompting the declaration of a state of emergency on GBV by the Nigeria Governors Forum in June in 2020. So the restrictions and lockdown measures presented barriers to help seeking options for GBV survivors and reduced footprints of actors that affected the availability and quality of service provision as well. There has, however, been improvements as restrictions in movement have reduced in Nigeria, and there has not been any lockdown for over a year now. But up to now, community-based prevention activities have greatly been affected due to requirements for social distancing. The avenues through which communities can engage or raise awareness on dangers of GBV and information on services available are restricted. Confidential spaces, for example, including service provision hubs, were established in some of the urban areas like Maiduguri in the Northeast to provide remote services through telephone helplines and support survivors and other vulnerable individuals to access GBV case management and psychosocial support services. However, in inaccessible and hard to reach communities due to high security risk and technological limitations, women and girls have limited or no information about GBV, and access to case management and psychosocial services is also lacking or grossly inadequate in these areas. Also, access to justice, psychosocial support and healthcare services are limited for both men and women, and the barriers to access also include lack of income and limited availability of the services, as well as trained or qualified personnel. So in a nutshell, this is a brief overview of the prevailing situation in Nigeria. But I would also like to mention that In response to what April mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, UN Women is working across the sectors to roll out the gender in humanitarian action to ensure an integrated approach and also strengthen gender equality programming, which will contribute greatly to GBV prevention. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Salimatu. Thank you for giving us this critical example of Nigeria, a 12-year-old conflict that has not been discussed as frequent as the other conflicts, but of course critical when discussing GBV and Acces. Thank you so much. We are now going towards the end of our panel, and we will open up the floor for questions. We got some really good questions in the chat. The first one is coming from our gender officer in Syria. Hello, Monica. So the question says, coordination amongst humanitarian actors to increase access and decrease GBV risks, coupled with integrated GBV and other sectors programs. Is this in place in any of the operations of the panelists? If so, any best practices to be followed in countries where